Good evening. This is Susan Kokindo with LaRouche PAC. I want to welcome you to tonight's class, which will be presented by Bob Ingram. I want to make a few brief opening remarks, given the circumstances we find ourselves in the United States and in the world today. As the title of the class states, the economic crisis will not be solved by money. It's only going to be solved by culture. And obviously, the crises facing us are manifold. You're all living the economic crisis every day when you walk into a supermarket. The strategic crisis is extremely stark. As Donald Trump has warned, first come the tanks, then come the nukes. And in the recent days, the very well-respected investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put forward a shocking and compelling case that it was the United States that bombed the Nord Stream pipeline several months ago as part of their assault on both Russia and, for that matter, Germany. The cultural crisis hits you every day as you watch what happens when children walk into classrooms throughout the United States. So the crises are manifold. The challenge that we face, and I think Bob is going to address this in this class, is that it's not sufficient to simply react negatively to those crises. Obviously, we have to stop the assault on children's minds and bodies in what passes for our education system and culture. We have to stop the provocative perpetual war policies and the sending of billions and billions of dollars overseas for useless and dangerous wars. We have to stop printing money like there's no tomorrow, as the Biden collective has been doing. But more fundamentally, the question is, what are the principles by which you generate policies which will actually advance your society and advance mankind? And one must go beyond reaction for that. Tomorrow is the anniversary of two events. Most people know that it's Abraham Lincoln's the anniversary of his birthday, one of our greatest presidents, who understood this question of generating policy from a profound commitment to principles, deeply felt and deeply understood principles that characterized his presidency and his leadership of this country. Tomorrow is also the fourth anniversary of the passing of our founder, Lyndon LaRouche. And he had a passion. That passion was to, like Lincoln, promulgate policies from a constantly evolving exploration of what the principles are embedded in our universe. And he, like great physicists like Albert Einstein and Max Planck, who lived their lives in an effort to develop a unified field theory, to develop the idea that there's not one set of laws for mechanics and one set of laws for chemistry and one set of laws for biology and one set of laws for astronomy, but that obviously there was a single generative principle that guided both the physical universe and our activity as physical and spiritual beings within it. And Lyndon LaRouche continued that exploration and brought it into every single aspect of his political campaigns, his education, and his fight to make this planet a better place. So tonight, Bob is going to look at perhaps we can call it LaRouche's unified field theory in terms of various aspects of the crisis and the solutions before us. So I will turn it over to Bob.
All right, well, that's a pretty daunting task that Susan's laid out for me. I just will say in sort of in brief preparation or introduction that in some ways that what I'm going to present tonight is not a continuation, but sort of a succeeding article or succeeding class on the material that I presented 3 weeks ago on the question of sovereignty. And also I want to reference 2 other recent postings on the LaRouche PAC website, which are of relevance to what we're going to be discussing tonight. One is the class last Saturday by Mike Stager and Keisha Rogers, which was called Think Big, Build Big, Building America for the 21st Century. And then the second thing is the interview with Brian Lance done by Susan on February 8th, titled America's Hidden Store of Skilled Manpower and Manufacturing. Now, I'm not going to, at all discuss what was discussed in those 2 other presentations, but it is relevant. And I would urge everyone who has not already seen last week's class or watched the interview with Brian to do so. There is a wealth of material in there as to how we can immediately begin to rebuild our productive economy and actually launch a renaissance in the arena of the most advanced scientific and technological frontier work. So I will just leave that at that. Now, I'm going to begin by reading to you a short quote from Lyndon LaRouche. It's only 3 or 4 sentences. And I would suspect that probably almost everyone who is in this meeting tonight received the email invitation. And what some of you may not have seen, noticed is that at the bottom of that email, there was a link provided, and you could go back to the email and click on the link to the entire document. But there was a link provided to a speech that Lyndon LaRouche gave in 1994, which was given the title, "In Music, There is a scientific principle which ennobles the soul." And it is a phenomenal short little speech by LaRouche. And I strongly urge everyone to read it as soon as you can. But I'll read you a short quote from it where LaRouche says, "Man is God's creature in the universe for a mission which we do not know fully, but we know we have to go in a certain direction. And so we should go happily in that direction. And we are able to do so because unlike any other living creature, we have the creative power of reason to change ourselves for the better, to increase our mastery of nature, and to solve the problems that face man with creatively directed efforts." Now, just to make sure this sinks in with people, I don't like to do this, but I'm going to read it again. Man is God's creature in the universe for a mission which we do not know fully, but we know we have to go in a certain direction, and so we should go happily in that direction. And we are able to do so because unlike any other living creature, we have the creative power of reason to change ourselves for the better, to increase our mastery of nature, and to solve the problems that face man with creatively directed efforts. So that's to introduce what will now follow. Now, I'm not going to, this is not going to be a class which tries to, discuss Lyndon LaRouche's approach to creativity in depth or anything like that. It is really focused on one point, which I think is relevant in my mind to sort of the political challenges that we face today in building our movement and in getting Trump back in the White House in 2025. And, obviously, Susan referenced some of this in her opening remarks. There are a lot of problems we're dealing with and a lot of key issues, crucial issues. I mean, one of which is the massive corruption within our Department of Justice, within our intelligence agencies, and all of the things that go along with that, all of the things we've seen revealed in the Twitter files. Now, in order to focus on what I want to talk about, I'm not going to talk about any of those things. I'm certainly not going to talk about the Chinese balloon or any of this nonsense. Some of this, particularly this question of the censorship and the rigging of elections, some of this is of extraordinary importance. But what's necessary, what I need to do to get across the theme of this class is to focus on the particular issue. And what I want to talk about is that not only within the MAGA movement, because I'm not going to restrict it to that, and I'm certainly not going to restrict it to registered Republicans, but within the American people, there are two issues that are really, you could call them life and death, life or death issues, or there are two concerns which are weighing very, very heavily on the American people. One is the worsening economic crisis and the effects that is having on almost everyone in society except the top 1%. We all know the various facets of that, from the inflation to a lot of other things. The disappearance of our manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of attention being paid to this right now by many different people, some Trump supporters, a lot of them not Trump supporters, but you have websites, you have what are called web magazines, sites like American Affairs, American Compass, the ITIF, which is the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And many of these websites and, and magazines and what have you, and people in various universities are devoting a great deal of attention to what it will take to rebuild America's manufacturing base and to develop the revolutionary technologies we need to move forward. Actually, Brian Lance is much more of an expert on this than I am. But this is, this is a ongoing discussion which is taking place. And meanwhile, the effects of the actual economic crisis that exists right now are driving the American people down, down, down. Then you have a second issue, which is, not limited to the Republican Party by any means, but which is, very much at the top of the minds of many of the grassroots organizers within the Republican Party, which is the cultural degradation in the country and the cultural onslaught against particularly youth, America's young people. And this, and again, I don't need to go into details of that, everyone is aware of it. Some people are aware of it in their own lives and what's happening to them and their children. Probably some of the people on this call, you know, the transgenderism, the wokeism, you know, the rise in suicides, the drug epidemic. I mean, the absolute destruction of the moral foundation and the culture of the United States. Now, I mean, if you look at you know, one of these things, the economic issue, you know, people tend to deal with this, and they'll say this is a nuts and bolts issue. You know, it's a dollars and cents issue. You know, how should we invest our money? What kind of economic decisions should be made? You know, sort of an impersonal sort of economic debate. You know, but on the other hand, you know, if you look at what's happening to our young people and what's happening in the schools, people will say this is a moral issue. You know, you know, you know, you know, we have to fight this immorality. You know, we have to save our children. We have to return America to some sort of decent culture. Now, I mean, there's a lot I could say about both of those things. I mean, on the one hand, in terms of this economic issue, I mean, Brian and again, Mike and Keisha have laid out, you know, a very clear perspective on the direction we have to move in. But what I find, not with them, but when I go to these various websites and places like that that are devoted to economic policy, I mean, some of the policy is okay, some of it is decent, a lot of it is not good. But I find a different kind of problem, which is that all of these people who discuss economics, who discuss tariffs, who discuss bringing back manufacturing, it's all very impersonal. You know, it's, you know, what are we going to do to increase our national productivity? What are we going to do to increase our manufacturing? You know, what are we going to do to, you know, ensure we have adequate energy supplies? And it's not that any of those things are unimportant, but it's usually discussed as if human beings don't exist. You know, it's like we're talking about an economy, you know, and how are we going to get the economy going without any discussion of individual human beings, individual citizens, and the role of creative human beings in economic development. And on the other hand, you know, if you look at this question of the schools, what's being done to our younger generation and what's being done to our culture more generally, you know, people decry this. They are extremely upset about this, justifiably so. But again, there's not much presented there in the way of solutions. They say, well, we're going to kick transgenderism out of the schools. Okay, well, we should do that. We should kick woke education out of the schools. Okay, we should do that. But is that going to fix the problem? You know, and what you get among some of these people who are fighting on this moral level, this moral battlefield, is among some of them, you know, some of the evangelical Christians, and I'm not trying to signal them out, but among some of these people, you get, you know, what I would call a nostalgia for the 1950s. You know, let's go back to the 1950s, you know, the era of, you know, Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best, and where, you know, everyone dressed nice and acted nice, family values, cleanliness, and all of this. And, you know, I want to assert to you, or at least say it is strongly my view, that that cannot possibly work. First of all, you know, the era, you know, the era that is presented about the 1950s is a 1950s, you know, that never really even existed. let's not forget that Father Knows Best or the Donna Reed Show were television shows, and it's also worth remembering that all of the, you can go back and you see, you can go on YouTube and stuff, and you can see these videos of life in the 1950s. And you got the mother and the father and the kids, and they're out on a picnic or they're taking a drive, and everything looks so wholesome and looks so nice. But let us not forget that the kids in those videos or in those photographs, the children of the 1950s, grew up to be the, participants in the rock, drug, sex counterculture of the 1960s. So, there was, look, the reality is that the 1950s, although it looks good today compared to what we have if you walk outside your door and walk down the street, it looks good today, but it was a failed culture because it did not reproduce itself. It did not reproduce itself to a higher level. So I think we have to take a different standpoint, and the first thing I would assert, in moving forward in this presentation, is that these two things, this question of economic policy and this question of culture and morality, are not different, as Susan sort of indicated in her opening remarks. Not only are they not different, but they are governed by the same exact scientific principles. There is no difference, right? And and what Lyndon LaRouche always insisted is that and he stated this in many occasions, is that you can't divorce the physical from the spiritual. You can't divorce the physical from the spiritual. And that's something to think about. That culture, art, science, and physical economy, culture, art, science, and physical economy are all the same thing. They're governed by the same truthful principles. And most people don't think that way, as you know. Maybe you don't think that way. We'll find out in the discussion. But for most people, art, music, things like that, people say, well, this is a matter of taste. It's non-rigorous. It's different for every person. It's based on emotions. It's based on psychology. Whereas science is based on cold, hard facts, mathematical formulas. That art is ethereal, undefined, and that science is linear and logical. Now, that's not what Lyndon LaRouche thought. And, we're not going to complete this discussion tonight, but I hope to introduce, some ideas which might get people to think about it. Because, look, whether it's art or classical music or science or physical economy, we're living in human society. And what you are confronted with is the question of the future. How to perpetuate our species, the human species, into the future for our posterity, as the United States Constitution calls upon us to do. And how do we advance our republic into the future? Hopefully, necessarily, at a higher level, higher physical level, scientific level, moral level, cultural level. How do we go about attempting to do that? And and as Lennon insisted, it is the same principles involved in all of this. And I'll also make a certain, just sort of introduce a little anecdote here. But LaRouche once remarked, and I'm not sure exactly where it might have been in the 1994 speech, but not there, somewhere else. He once remarked, because, LaRouche had a wide variety of very creative friends and associates over the years, people he collaborated with. And he once remarked that he never met a creative scientist, physical scientist. He never met a creative scientist who was not also engaged, personally engaged in some form of classical music or art. And I would also ask people. Many people do not know this, but the famous relationship between Einstein and his violin. He was devoted to his violin throughout his life. And there's some story, I don't even know if it's true or not, but I heard it so many times that I'm assuming it's true. And I may butcher the details of it. And if someone wants to correct me later, they can. But there was some story that Einstein was at a scientific conference, and he had presented something in his remarks, and someone in the audience, I believe, and again, I might have the details wrong, someone in the audience got up and challenged what he had said in his scientific remarks. And Einstein came back to the podium, and without saying a word, he picked up his violin and played something from Mendelssohn or Mozart or somebody and sat down. And that was the answer he gave to the person who had challenged what he had to say scientifically. And then again, and you also have the question of Lincoln, which is a little bit different. Maybe it's a lot different, but Lincoln, who, was, with Washington, the two greatest presidents in our history, who also, devised the greenback policy and many other things, of Lincoln's lifelong relationship with Shakespeare. Whereas, one of his associates remarked, Lincoln was a voracious reader, read from morning till night throughout his life. And as one of his associates remarked, Lincoln spent more time reading Shakespeare than all of his other readings combined. He was devoted to him. These are just some things to think about. Now, what I'm going to do is, and this is a little challenging, but I'm going to read to you a short quote, about 2 paragraphs, from a work which LaRouche authored about 50 years ago, called Beyond Psychoanalysis, which is not that readily available today. I guess it is available. And I will just issue a word of warning to those who want to pursue it. You have to put what LaRouche wrote at that time within the context of the time he wrote it. But that does not take away from the rigorousness of his argument. But I just want to read to you 2 paragraphs from that work, and they go as follows. Where the society does not recognize the creative processes of the human mind as the basis for individual social identity, the form of the ego must be that of a monad, which, stripped of its persona qualities, becomes a mere object, lacking in any social identity, and it And then he goes on to say a little bit later on, the primary feeling state is love. The effective content and form of recall of the creative process itself, the invariant human quality of the mind. To understand the dynamics of love, one begins by inquiring as to what practical expressions can be given to the direct calling forth of the universal for all particular expressions of social creative activity. Every detail dissolves. The mind is dissolved into pure creative ferment, the universality of the creative act. And he goes on to say that, out of that, that process, that thinking process, then demands a subsequent action on the creative breakthrough, which has been made. I'm probably wording that poorly, but I think people might get the gist of it. That, and you go back to what he says at the beginning there, that the creative process of the human mind is the basis for individual social identity, for the human being, but also for social interactions with our fellow citizens, our fellow human beings. And that if that is denied us, or if the expression of that is denied us, then we are reduced to being what he calls the social identity of an it, and this is really sort of related to the Hobbesian notion, Thomas Hobbes, of, a war of each against all, where in a society in which human creativity is not encouraged, particularly in the individual child, and does then not become the basis for social relations, if that is denied us, if that is blocked, then it forces the human being back into a paranoid sense of identity, of warfare, of competition, in the wrong sense of the word competition, with everyone around us, with all of our other fellow human beings. We begin to act like beasts, where you've got, the wrong form of competition, where a herd of lions kill a giraffe and then compete with each other to eat the giraffe. That is, it is only this spark of reason and creativity which forms the basis for positive social relations and for the development of your society to a higher level. What Lynn is discussing is the creative human identity, but he's discussing it in a very advanced way in terms of not just the individual, but society as a whole. It is deeply personal, but it is also a social identity. And as that creative principle is applied to art, to music, to economics, to science, that is the basis for perpetuating our republic and our civilization into the future. It's also the basis for a republican citizenry, as opposed to a mob. I'm not a big fan of some of these people on the internet right now. I mean, obviously, I'm not a big fan of the woke crowd, and their lunacy. But even some of these so-called, right-wing populists who just get up and scream and scream and scream with rage. This is not only not useful, it's extraordinarily counterproductive. Because our goal is to build, and we have to build what we're doing based on truthful principles. Now, this leads me into a discussion, since we're dealing with the crisis in the schools, to several proposals that LaRouche made about education. He wrote a lot about education, but one of his proposals was that he called for the introduction of choral singing in the schools, beginning at the earliest possible age. Now, I don't know if that applies to preschool, maybe, but it certainly applies to kindergarten or grades 1, 2, 3. At the earliest possible age, introducing choral singing, which then introduces these young children to the question of the bel canto method of singing. It introduces young children to the question of polyphony. And it begins to train the mind, or to open up the mind is maybe a better way to put it, to discover certain creative powers within their own minds, discoveries that can be made even by the youngest of children, in regard to singing, in regard to the voice, in regard to harmony, in regard to polyphony, discoveries about how the universe works, about themselves, in a rigorous way. Not, the problem when you deal with creativity is you get all these people who think, like Jackson Pollock, you throw paint on the wall and it's creative. Rigorous creativity, which is tested, which is proven to be truthful. And Lynn brought up this question of choral singing in the schools many, many times, to intervene at the youngest possible age with young children in this way. Now, another thing he also talked about, which one could argue is less important, but it's not unimportant, is in this question of science and mathematics. LaRouche always insisted that this must begin, again, at a very young age. You could start this very early, I don't know what grade, first grade, second grade, third grade, but you could start it very, very early, which is to begin to introduce the question of mathematics around using, what's called constructive geometry. I could tell you that one of the things that LaRouche hated, despised, was drill and grill education, including standardized tests. Now, a lot of people, given the horrendous quality of our schools right now, and you hear this from people all the time, is, going back to standardized tests, because standardized tests were weakened or eliminated by these left-wing Democrats and what have you. And that's true, that is true. I mean, they just don't want to teach anybody anything, that's, they don't care if people who graduate from high school can't read or write. But, the problem that LaRouche had with standardized tests and with drill and grill education is it's all based on memorization. You memorize formulas, you memorize algebraic formulas, you memorize dates for a history examination, and frankly, a computer can do that. And it could do it better than a human being could do it. The question here is, creating a situation in which the young student begins to gain confidence, not memorizing and getting up and reciting like a parrot, but begins to gain confidence in their own minds, to make discoveries, to think things through on their own. And for those who are not familiar with constructive geometry, I'm not going to get into it tonight, and I'm not an expert on it. But, it's, you can find a lot of material on this, and people like Mike Carr and others know a lot about it. Bruce probably. But it's a question of, as opposed to memorizing, for instance, the Pythagorean theorem, you construct the Pythagorean theorem. So instead of having a formula, which you memorize, which means nothing to you, in constructing it, you've discovered something about how the universe is organized. And that now becomes part of your mind. You're not going to forget it because it's something you have mastered, as an idea. What you're looking for in education, is not just having students who are proficient in giving the correct answer according to a textbook. You're building up the independent strength, the confidence of the creative identity within the individual child. And that really, if you think about it, a child who has confidence in their own ability to think, to solve problems, that's one of the most precious things in our society. That is how, you can become optimistic about the future when you have that approach to education. And it is the same in art, in music, in science, you're in economics. You're creating a power within the mind to make discoveries. That is what you are aiming for. So what I want to do, I don't want to drag this out, but I want to reference a couple of things which may seem a little bit off topic, and then I'll wrap it up. I want to read to you and again, this is sort of an abrupt shift here, but I want to read to you 2 paragraphs from the first public speech that Abraham Lincoln ever gave. So since Lincoln's birthday is tomorrow, I think this is appropriate. This was on March 9th, 1832. Excuse me. It's in his first public speech. And he's talking about education. And he says, upon the subject of education, not presuming to dictate any plan or system respecting it, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in, the most important subject. That every man may receive at least a moderate education, and thereby be enabled to read the histories of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions, appears to me to be an object of vital importance. And then he goes on to say, for my part, I desire to see the time when education, and by its means, morality, sobriety, enterprise, and industry shall become much more general than at present, and should be gratified to have it in my power to contribute something to the happy advancement of any measure which might have a tendency to accelerate that happy period. So that's the importance which Lincoln placed on education. And I will say, and then I want to sort of segue from that into something related to Lincoln, which is, I've mentioned this in previous classes, and there's a chapter written by my wife about this in the book I published on Abraham Lincoln. which is the Lyceum movement. And I'm only going to just mention it here. But the Lyceum movement, which began in 1826 by a man named Hosea Holbrook, this existed through the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. It started in Massachusetts. It spread all over the country, and it was not directed towards children. It was really directed towards young adults and other people. It started out with a lot of what you could call almost vocational education, and then scientific education. But then as it evolved, it became much more broad in terms of the topics that were discussed, and you could call it ongoing adult education, and in many cases at a very high level. And it spread all over the country. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds or more of these lyceums everywhere. And Lincoln was a regular participant in the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, during the 1840s, 30s and 40s, and maybe later. But I only bring up the Lyceum movement to get to the next person, who I've also talked about before, which is Thomas Starr King, because I'm not going to read to you from anything he wrote, but I want to reference something that he did. Now, for those who don't know him, Thomas Starr King was a minister who moved from Massachusetts to California prior to the Civil War, and who played a paramount role, really a very important role, in keeping California in the Union in 1859, 60, 61, because many people may not be aware that California came pretty darn close to seceding from the Union, in 1860. And Thomas Starr King was one of the main people who stopped that from happening. Now, the reason why I mention that is because in 1860, and I don't have the exact years, it might have even been 1859, but certainly in 1860 and going into 1861, Thomas Starr King, who was a regular participant in the Lyceum movement, and who gave lectures and presented papers at the Lyceum movement, many times. He was a regular speaker on that circuit. But in around 1860, 1861, he embarked on a whole series of tours around California as part of his campaign to keep California in the Union, to prevent secession. And he visited, at that time, the majority of the population was in Northern California because of the gold rush. And he visited all kinds of places, dozens of places, mining camps, rural communities, farm areas, small towns, villages, and he spoke at these people. Now, what's interesting is what he presented in his speeches. Now remember, this is a campaign to stop California from seceding. And in touring, he delivered a number of speeches. Now, I'll just give you the titles of a couple of them. One is called Socrates. One is called Sight and Insight. One is called Substance and Show. And he delivered others of this type. And these were all speeches which were deeply philosophical, went into substantive issues, in regard to human society, human culture, the nature of what it means to be a human being. Now, the lecture on Socrates, which, as I said, I'm not going to read from, but the lecture on Socrates, this lecture lasted 2 to 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours on Socrates, on his life, on his pursuit of truth, on his, a thorough examination of Socrates, and it lasted 2 to 3 hours. Now, Thomas Starr King would go into these mining towns, up in the Sierra Nevadas, these mining camps, where there'd be 100 or 200 or 500 or more of these miners, and wagon drivers and people like that, none of whom had ever been to a university. Probably the majority of them had never even graduated from high school. And he would deliver a 2.5-hour lecture on Socrates to these people as his argument of why California should remain in the Union. Now, that's pretty extraordinary, and it's, you have to think about that. Not that, if people want to know what to do about the CIA and what have you, we should, unleash on them a 2-hour lecture on Socrates. But what he was addressing in these people was not simply the pragmatic issue, but really the nature of the human identity that was the basis for the American Republic. And that this was what was really at stake in the fight. Human civilization itself. That was what was at stake. That's why California could not secede. And it's really a remarkable thing that he did. And so look, I'll just sort of bring this to an end. But I do want to bring it back to the political reality we're facing today. To inject politics here. You've got this whole assault on Trump going on right now. You've got this whole, puffing up by the deep state, by the oligarchy of DeSantis. And that's who's behind DeSantis, the oligarchy. He's the Bush crowd. And you've got this whole argument of what we need is Trumpism without Trump, this kind of thing, And, what I've been discussing here, it may not seem apparent to you, and it also may not seem apparent either to science, because I don't think I made that connection clear enough, but I will before I end. But what I'm discussing here is directly relevant to this question of Trump, because the fact is, the United States Republic is a presidential system. Now, some people have the wrong idea about a presidential system, or some people even disagree with that, like Thomas Jefferson. But some people think, well, you're talking about the presidency. Well, we are talking about the presidency, but when they talk about the presidency, what they're talking about is the executive branch of government, which is nothing but a bureaucracy, right? All of the branches, the health department, this department, State Department, it's a giant bureaucracy. And, the executive branch of government is really not a synonym, it's really not, for the presidency, because the presidency is a personal question. In one sense, yes, we have a presidency, but in another sense, we have a presidential system. But that is personified in a president, right? Now, this gets back to the question of the human individual. If you look at Lincoln, if you look at what I presented in past weeks on Washington, an individual who is thinking creatively, who is courageous, who is going to act. You know, this is how you move the nation forward. And, you know, for people who say, well, you know, we could have Trumpism without Trump. Trump's got too much baggage. Trump this, Trump that. You know, I don't like Trump. You know, he acts like a New Yorker. You know, he's too rude. He's rude. Oh my God, what a crime. He's rude. Look, this is what the oligarchy fears. A creative, courageous individual in the White House. That's what they fear. They don't fear a grassroots movement. They don't. Now, if we're going to make this work, we have to have a grassroots movement that's going to work in tandem with Trump and to support Trump and to fight to get Trump back in the White House. We have to do that. That's our duty, our role. But the oligarchy doesn't fear grassroots movements. They fear creative individuals, courageous, creative individuals. Like you take, and some people might get flipped out on this, I don't care. You take the Tea Party, or if you're a left-winger, Bernie Sanders type, you take, Occupy Wall Street. Do you think anybody in the global financial oligarchy was afraid of the Tea Party or afraid of Occupy Wall Street? No, these are little irritations, little things you flick off your arm, little fleas. What they're afraid of is the creative personality, the courageous creative personality who also is filled with love of his country and love of his fellow citizens. Now, this, gets back to just to return it to this question of science, because I don't think I did that justice at all. Do we need more science education in the schools? Absolutely. Only an idiot would argue with that. You've got this thing where they call science, technology, engineering, and manufacturing, STEM, mathematics, STEM, science, STEM curriculum, and of course that could be probably drastically improved upon. But you've got a lot of people calling for emphasis on science. Yes, we need all of that. We desperately need all of that. But the fact is, this is where the question of choral singing in kindergarten comes in. This is the question of where constructive geometry comes in, because you need more than just training in science and technology. What we need are creative individuals. You look at the Wright brothers, you need people who are going to make revolutions in science, revolutions in technology, revolutions in human understanding of the universe, right? And that's where this all comes in. And that's why the solution to our economic problem, our scientific challenges, and our cultural decay, it all circles back to this question of the creative identity. And that all begins in the schools. With participation, very much so, of the parents of the children. So I don't know if any of that was coherent, but I'm going to stop right here. Okay, folks?